Yes, yes, yes. We are enough. We are enough. Well, hello, and good morning again to each and every one of you. It is so good to be here. I don't want to spend too much time on formalities because we have a lot to talk about, as there has been a lot going on. I must admit that as we move through this week, and as we moved even through last week with the hearings and the roller coaster that it's been, the FBI investigation to the sham investigation to the confirmation and the final vote yesterday, I've been moving through a range of emotions. And, I found myself in a very difficult place because I said, okay, Spirit, what am I supposed to say on Sunday? And it took me a long time to really get clear to hear the voice of truth. But I'm so glad we're doing this series this month because this series is really what helped to guide me. I love, as we shared in the synopsis, this idea about the folklore of how the Tao Te Ching came into being, that Lao Tzu, this wise man, was fed up with the politicians' ineptitude and cruelty, and he was fed up with the endless suffering of the people. That just sounds like right now. Right? But even in the midst of that, he was able to write the book of truth, the 81 life-giving, challenging, and transformative verses of the Tao Te Ching. And so I found myself searching through the verses. I love this text. I've studied this text. Searching and looking at texts that I love and verses that are familiar to me, and they weren't saying nothing. Right? Right, I looked at that and I'm like, yeah, because I was in my feelings. I was in my emotions. But I persisted. And as I persisted, I came to a verse that actually felt unfamiliar, as though I had never read it before, and I know I have. And I came to verse 28. Now, I want to share, and I encourage each and every one of you to get a copy of this text, the Tao Te Ching, the Jonathan Starr translation. This is the translation that we're going to be using. Very important. The Tao Te Ching, Jonathan Starr translation. It's published by Tarcher Penguin. Okay? And so I'm going to read verse 28 to you. Hold your male side with your female side. Hold your bright side with your dull side. Hold your high side with your low side. Then you will be able to hold the whole world. When the opposing forces unite within, there comes a power abundant in its giving and unerring in its effect. Flowing through everything, it returns one to the first breath. Guiding everything, it returns one to no limits. Embracing everything, it returns one to the uncarved block. When the block is divided, it becomes something useful, and leaders rule with a few pieces of it. But the sage holds the block complete. Holding all things within himself, he preserves the great unity which cannot be ruled or divided. Now, as we stand in this moment in history in this country, there is no question that it's time for action. Yes, yes? There's no question that it's time for us to respond. Yes, yes. There is no question that it's time for us to mobilize. Yes, yes. And so we recognize, I just want to say first, that here in the state of New York, voter registration closes on the 12th. So if you are not registered, you still have time to register and to vote, right? But what I understand, as we recognize, we all agree, it's time for action, it's time to respond, it's time to mobilize. How we do this is far more important than what we do. And so what I want to focus in on is the vibrational current underneath that we need in order to be able to enact the change that we want. Now, I want to highlight this first piece of this verse. When the opposing forces unite within, there comes a power abundant in its giving and unerring in its effect. Guiding everything, it returns one to no limits. What it is saying here is an interesting thing. It's saying that the unlimited power, true, lasting unlimited power, actually comes from unity. When opposing forces unite within, there comes a power, and it's giving and unerring in its effect. It's actually to the point where it says, guiding everything, it returns one to no limits. You can't be stopped. But this requires a unity. Now, when we talk about opposing forces here, we're not talking about opposing forces as necessarily in Republican and Democrat, right? we hear something interesting in the beginning of the verse where it says, hold your male side with your female side. Hold your bright side with your dull side, and hold your high side with your low side. And so as we recognize that, then he goes a little further, deeper in the second piece where he says, when the block is divided, it becomes something useful, and leaders rule with a few pieces of it. But the sage holds the block complete. Holding all things within himself, he preserves the great unity, which cannot be ruled or divided. And so what I recognize then is that as we are seeking to mobilize, as we are seeking to take action, as we are seeking to respond, it's important that we're operating from this great unity that Lao Tzu is talking about. And it may be different than what you may have come to understand. Because what he is really saying is that in order to access this great unity that he's talking about here, there are some things that we must acknowledge, and there are things that we must heal. Because what I recognize is that even on the progressive and the liberal side, there's actually a disunity. As he also talks about here, he says, when the block is divided, it becomes something useful, and leaders will rule with pieces of it. So on the progressive side, there are a few of us who have established little coalitions here and there, but there's actually some disconnects and some disunity, which means that we're not operating in our full power. We're not operating in this place where it's abundant in its giving, unerring in its effect, and we have no limits. So what am I talking about? I'm going to give us a couple of examples here, and there are many more that we could talk about, but this is important for us to understand. So there was someone who shared, I actually saw this last night, someone who shared a post on Facebook from Elizabeth Gilbert. You all know Elizabeth Gilbert. She wrote Eat, Pray, Love. I think her second book is Big Magic. We love her, right? She's awesome. And she had written this post, and the image of the post says, "Woman has no government." And she went on to talk about a number of different things, and I just want to pull out this one thing that she wrote. She wrote here, in 1776, Abigail Adams wrote a famous letter to her husband, John Adams, begging him to, quote, remember the ladies, end quote, as he was creating this bold new American government. She asked that women's concerns be included in the conversation. His response was to completely patronize her and dismiss her. He wrote back, I cannot help but laugh, he said, you are so saucy. He ridiculed her, but the patriarchy is no joke. It is deep and old and strongly invested in keeping its power. Interesting, right? Now, of course, we recognize that there needs to be, as Lao Tzu says, hold your male side with your female side. There needs to be a unity, that John Adams couldn't see the connection, right? Even as he was doing something profound and revolutionary, what those brothers did, interesting, right? Now, Elizabeth Gilbert was using that example to talk about how women have continuously been oppressed in this country. But from my lens, I saw something else. Because I said, as we use that example, Sister Elizabeth Gilbert, you ignored something very profound. Because while you want to use that example to talk about the plight of women, you also have to understand that Abigail Adams was also a part of and complicit within a system that enslaved human beings. Very interesting. And so we recognize that we have to begin to acknowledge all of these things and have these conversations. Not that this is not powerful, not that this is not a necessary critique, and not that we don't need to talk about it because it's true. All of those men that signed the Declaration of Independence were slave owners, right? We know that, right? So we have to begin to acknowledge these things. We cannot just say, oh, poor Abigail Adams. She didn't get her rights. At the same time, she was not acknowledging the rights and the humanity of millions. So we have to have that kind of conversation. This is the only, and until we have this conversation, there's going to be this divide. Until we have this conversation, it's going to be some pieces of the block are coming together and you get some change, but you don't get this powerful, profound change that Lao Tzu is talking about we can have. Now, even as I say that, as an African-American man, I can say, oh, well, Abigail, you know, you're not thinking about the brothers. You're not thinking about the sisters. What about slavery? But then as an African-American male, I have to understand and say that we have been oppressors of African-American women. It's a conversation that we need to have because this is the only way that we're going to heal the divide. Now, we can talk about how it happened and all these other things, but we recognize that brothers need to check themselves. We recognize that brothers need to take a look and say, wait, how have I contributed to oppression of my sisters, of my daughters, of my wife, of the women in my family, known and unknown, right? We got to have that same conversation because we recognize just as I'm calling Abigail out, as soon as I call her out, there's fingers pointing right back at me. But I recognize, again, until we have these types of conversations and acknowledge these things, then we're going to be operating, as he says, when the block is divided, it becomes something useful, and leaders rule with pieces of it. But the sage holds the block complete, holding all things within himself. He preserves the great unity, which cannot be ruled or divided. And we need to be in this place where we cannot be ruled and we cannot be divided. Now, let's look at another community. We know that oftentimes within the LGBT community, our trans brothers and sisters are treated like second-class citizens. Same type of conversation, right? Same type of conversation. We recognize that there's some things that we need to heal. There's some division on our side, if you will, this progressive liberal side that is actually keeping us splintered, which is why we never actually have the power that we want to have. This is why we never actually see the change that we really want to have. And what Lao Tzu is saying, it's possible. It's possible for us to live in a place where we have no limits. It's possible for us to be in a place where the giving that we receive is abundant and unending. But there's some conversations like this we need to have. Now here's another example. As a non-disabled person, if you are a non-disabled person in the room, when was the last time you considered how a law might affect someone with a disability? Right, just real talk. One of the things Pastor Yolanda and I talk about often, before her injury or after her injury, right, we became more aware of the different things. For myself, I have to think ahead to, wait, are there elevators at that place? Things that we just didn't think about before, right? Recognizing that now we have to think about that, but we never did before. There's something interesting that's happening right now, and you all know, of course, I care about the environment, and I'm very passionate about it. And one of the things that's been happening, a lot of places, including Starbucks, are instituting no straw policies, right? Because of the plastic, right? And we applaud for that. That's awesome. But it's interesting because there's been a conversation that's been happening this summer. This is an article from NPR in July. Check this out. Paper straws and similar biodegradable options often fall apart too easily and are easy for people with limited jaw control to bite through. Silicone straws are often not flexible, one of the most important features for people with mobility challenges. Reusable straws need to be washed, which not all people with disabilities can easily do. And metal straws, which conduct heat and cold in addition to being hard and inflexible, can pose a safety risk. And so we actually have those that are advocating for our brothers and sisters with disabilities and saying, let's think about this. Yes, we understand we don't want plastic in our oceans, but there has to be another way that we can think about this, because in being concerned about the oceans and removing it, you're actually now creating a hardship for another group of people that we hadn't considered, we hadn't even thought about. And so when we're not having these types of conversations, what's happening is that block is still divided. But again, as we read here, the power comes, we get to this great unity when we hold all things within ourselves. We get to this great unity when the opposing forces unite. There comes a power abundant in its giving, unerring in its effect, guiding everything it returns one to no limits. And so I recognize that some of these conversations may be difficult to have. What it requires is that we all must release our grip to the multiple tribes that we belong to. We all must release our grip to the multiple tribes that we belong to. I present as male, but I'm not male. I'm an eternal being that is male and female, and not male and not female. That's the truth. Your body is not who you are. Your body is your vehicle. And if you over-identify with your body, you become splintered, you become separate, and we have the things that we're experiencing right here and right now. So Lao Tzu writes, hold your male side with your female side. Unite all the tribes within yourself. Hold your bright side with your dull side. Unite all the tribes within yourself. Hold your high side with your low side. Unite all the tribes within yourself. And then he says, then you will be able to hold the world, hold the whole world. You've got the whole world in your hands. You've got the whole world in your hands, but I'm wondering if we can hear that song a little differently. I've got the whole world in my hands. I've got gay and straight in my hands, right? I've got disabled and non-disabled in my hands. I've got male and female in my hands because I want to unite. I want to unite. I need to live in that place where we recognize that we're all one, because that's the great unity and that's the power. I'm almost done. But as I say that we have to have these conversations, and I recognize that these conversations are difficult, there's something that must be at the center in order for us to have these conversations, and in order for these conversations to be transformative. And that thing is love. Now, that sounds really sentimental, and it's like, oh, wow, y'all woo-woo folks at the end of the day. Oh, love, it's all about love. If we all love each other, right? Every great sage, every great teacher has brought us to this, but I want us to bring us to something important. And this took me to Martin Luther King, because when we talk about love, we are not talking about some romantic notion, some syrupy sweet notion, some ideal that our movies give us. That's not what we're talking about. And in his seminal text, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, he writes this: one of the greatest problems of history is that the concepts of love and power are usually contrasted as polar opposites. Love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. And so we recognize from this understanding, when we're talking about bringing our male side with our female side and bringing our bright side with our dull side, it requires this love that Dr. Martin Luther King wrote about. And the love that informed him, the love that informed what he talked about, has everything to do with understanding, as we look in the New Testament, the word love in Greek actually has 3 different words. And the 3 different distinctions of love in Greek, we have eros, we have philia, and we have agape. Eros is a form of love that is most closely associated, in the words of Dr. King, with desire. Philia is often the love that is experienced between very good family and friends. But I want you to hear this. This is what Dr. King says about agape. Agape is a willingness to go to any length to restore community. I want you to hear that again, because this is the link. This is the piece that we need. Agape is a willingness to go to any length to restore community. Therefore, if I respond to hate with reciprocal hate, I do nothing but intensify the cleavages of a broken community. And so he's talking about this same division that Lao Tzu was talking about, that although we may not call it hate, right, but if I'm calling out Elizabeth Gilbert, I'm actually creating separation. I'm not operating in agape. But when I operate in agape, I'm willing to call my sister and say, let's have a conversation, because my agape love is my willingness to go to any length to restore community, my willingness to go to any length to restore this country, my willingness to go to any length to restore dignity back to every woman, my willingness to go to any length to restore dignity to this planet. That's love. That's agape. And when we operate from that place, then we hold the whole world in our hands. Then we hold true power in our hands, and it is giving in its effect. Then we hold true power in our hands, and we operate from no limits. Then we hold true power in our hands, and we speak to the mountain, and it's moved. Yes, it's time for us to take action. Yes, it's time for us to vote. It's time for us to mobilize. Yes, it's time for us to respond. But without agape, it's meaningless. Without agape, we will just have more of the same. Splintered, small coalitions here and there. But it requires the great unity. So I encourage you to look within yourself. What are the tribes within me that I need to unite? Look within yourself and say, what grip am I holding on to of a personality or a way of being or a way of identifying that I actually need to release in this moment? Because I recognize that it's only going to keep us living in this carved block, as Lao Tzu writes. It's useful, it's beneficial. I love the specific words he uses where he says it's, I don't see it now. Oh, yeah, he says something useful and leaders rule with a few pieces of it, right? We see that. Many of our progressive leaders, they got their little fiefdoms over here and little kingdom over here. They're ruling with a few pieces of it. Meanwhile, they're missing out, and we're missing out on the great unity. With that, I invite everybody to stand. Mother, Father, God, we know that you are love itself. And as you are love itself, every expression of love is you manifested. And we bring ourselves, our minds, and our attention here and now to the expression of agape love. This expression, which is our willingness to go to any length to restore community. This agape love, which is your love, the willingness to restore us back to sanity, as A Course in Miracles would say. Your love, your agape love, which is a willingness to bring us back to the truth of what we have always been, perfect, whole, and complete. Your unending, unerring willingness to bring us back to the truth that we remain as God created us, individually and as a community, as a country, as earthlings. And so right here and right now, as we bring our attention to it, we recognize that what we focus on expands. And so in our mind's eye, we fix our eyes and our attention on this love, and we let it grow. First, we let it grow within us. We let this agape love spread from our hearts and spread all throughout our very being, uniting the individual tribes within ourselves. The male within us speaks to the female within us and says, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And the female within us speaks to the male within us and says, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And the high and mighty side of ourselves speaks to the so-called low and mighty side of ourselves and says, I love you. I see you. We are one. And the disabled side of ourselves speaks to the non-disabled side of ourselves and says, teach me. Show me my blind spots. And we allow this love to permeate the tribes within us. Because in truth, we are one, we are unified, we are harmonized. And as we allow this great unity to well up and grow within ourselves, now we are able to go out into the world and become the facilitators of the great unity in this country, the great unity within our state, the great unity on our planet. And we allow this willingness, unending, unerring willingness to restore community, guide us into having conversations. We allow it to guide us into having conversations with those that don't look like us, those that don't necessarily think like us completely, those who we take issue with within our own community, our progressive community, our liberal community. And we heal the divide, and we heal the division, and we heal the triggers right here and right now. And as we do that, the truth is clear. We will operate in a power and from a power that we have never seen on this planet before. We will operate in a place where there is no limits, nothing against us. We will operate from a place that creates lasting and permanent change. Mother, Father God, for this truth and for this awareness and for this healing, I am so grateful. I now release this prayer. I let it do its work. I let it operate in the realm of the seen and the unseen. I let it be. And with joy and thanksgiving, we lift up our voices. We say, amen, ashe. And so it is. So it is. Thank you, God.